Yo, yo, yo! As always, it's your boy, Steven Moustaris. And guys, man, I think I can speak for most of us here. I think when it comes to the sport of MMA, one of the greatest things of all time are the title fights. And, you know, for most of us that have been watching the sport for a while, we used to only get like, what, 6 to 10 title fights an entire year. And now we're way more spoiled. We get like 3 a pay-per-view nowadays. We get 3 title fights a pay-per-view, it feels like, at least 3 or 4 times a year. So, you know, the title fights are way more often nowadays, but it also just produces some of the greatest moments ever. Not only are the stakes higher, the energy's higher, the fans are in it, you know, it's some of the greatest things ever. We see some of the greatest champions come out of the sport, you know, Anderson Silva, GSP, you know, Jon Jones, Demetrius Mighty Mouse Johnson. Like, not only does it separate, you know, the men from the boys, but also it produces some of the greatest fights that we've ever seen, like Jon Jones versus Gus or Frankie Edgar versus any of the Gray Maynard fights, you know, or it gives some of the greatest upsets we've ever seen, like when Conor McGregor knocked out Aldo or Matt Serra somehow beat GSP. You know, these are some of the greatest moments ever, and they all come from title fights. And in honor of Sean Strickland fighting this weekend when he's taking on Dricus Du Plessis, you know, not only did Sean Strickland give us one of the greatest moments of 2023, he also gave us one of the greatest upsets of all time in MMA. In honor of Sean Strickland this weekend, I decided to give you guys 10 of the most dominant performances by the challenger in title fights. So here we go. Number 10, Randy Couture versus Tim Sylvia at UFC 68. Now, there's no shock at all that Randy Couture has one of the most impressive MMA careers we've ever seen. Despite him not starting his MMA career until he was 34 years old in 1997, it just took the man 4 MMA fights to capture the UFC heavyweight gold by defeating Maurice Smith in the same year that he started. Now, although he did have to drop his belt due to some contract stuff, and he did come back a few years later to defeat Kelvin Randleman to become the champion once again. But where this gets even more impressive, and probably the most impressive part about his entire career, he decided to go down to light heavyweight at 40 years old to take on one of the biggest superstars we've ever seen in the sport in Chuck Liddell. And although not many people thought he was going to win, we saw one of the biggest upsets in UFC history as the 40-year-old Randy Couture knocked out Chuck Liddell in the 3rd round to capture the light heavyweight gold and to become the first 2-division champion we've ever seen in UFC history. And although he went on to lose to Vitor Belfort and drop 2 back-to-back vicious knockout losses to Chuck Liddell, it was time for the 44-year-old Randy Couture to move up to heavyweight and take on one of the most devastating strikers we had seen at the time at the heavyweight division. A 6'8" monster, Tim Sylvia, who came into this fight 23-2 with 16 knockouts. And this is one of the best things about going back and watching these fights is you almost forget how dominant Tim Sylvia was at the time. I know it's easy at 2024 to go back and look and be like, ooh, you know, he wasn't the most well-rounded fighter. His takedown defense was bad. Randy Couture had his way with him. But what made this fight so impressive was in the very first round, Randy Couture with an overhand right sat Tim Sylvia on his ass and then rode his way to one of the most dominant 5 rounds and further solidified why he was already a Hall of Famer and why he's well-deserved. And what makes this fight really impressive is Randy Couture went 138 of 205 strikes, landing at a 67% accuracy rate, with 7 out of 10 takedowns landed with more than 15 minutes and 51 seconds of control time, which is over 3 rounds, which is why this fight was so dominant. And he held Tim Sylvia to 39 of his 123 strikes at a 32% landing rate, which is absolutely masterful. So shouts out to Randy Couture, and well-deserved at number 10. Number 9, Kamaru Usman versus Tyron Woodley at UFC 235. Now, the only reason that this fight isn't higher on this list is strictly because we know what happened to Tyron Woodley after this fight. And even before then, the question with Tyron Woodley was always, would he show up in these fights? The man, when he was on, was one of the most impressive fighters we had ever seen. The way he knocked out Robbie Lawler, the way he knocked out Josh Koscheck, the way that man even destructed Darren Till, it was phenomenal, phenomenal. When he was at his best, he was truly one of the best in the world. But it was the fights like Rory McDonald, the Kelvin Gastelum fights, the Nate Marquardt fights, even the Jake Shields fight, where this man probably had a really good chance at winning, but he just didn't show up, and it looked like he would almost allow the other fighters to be the aggressor and to just absolutely dominate it. And just when you think Tyron Woodley's got it figured out with a few title defenses, bam, insert Kamaru Usman. Now, the most impressive part of this entire fight clearly is Kamaru Usman. This was his coming out party. At the time, he had fights against Sean Strickland, Damian Maia, RDA, and even Emil Meek, where, yes, they were dominant and he did win. It's just there was times that it looked like he just took his foot off the gas and almost looked like he didn't try half the time. And there was even some quotes after fights that, oh, this was only 30% of me. And there was a lot of questions to, okay, when it comes to a championship caliber fighter like Tyron Woodley, will he put the gas down? Will he have that dog in him? Will he be a dominant champion, or can he win these fights? And from the very beginning of the fight to the very end, Kamaru Usman beat Tyron Woodley from pillar to post, not leaving a single doubt in anybody's mind that this man was championship worthy. And my favorite thing about rewatching fights is you can actually recall what really happened instead of just remembering it. And for me personally, I thought Kamaru Usman landed like 14 takedowns this fight, but he somehow racks up 18 minutes and 13 seconds of control time on only 2 takedowns. And the other reason that there's so much control time is because Tyron Woodley tries to pull guillotine twice in this fight on one of the worst decisions he could have possibly done. And what makes this fight even more impressive, if you guys go to the UFC stat, it says Tyron Woodley lands 60 strikes in this fight, but there's absolutely no way. I think he lands 1 clean body kick in like the 4th round, and it's either the 3rd or 4th round. He lands a decent overhand right that kind of looks like it stunned Usman there for a little bit, but then Usman gets a takedown and completely dominates the rest of the round, so you don't even notice it. But 60 strikes, no way. And for Usman, he landed 336 of his 390 strikes in this fight, which makes it one of the most lopsided victories you've ever seen. And clearly, Kamaru Usman goes on to defend the belt 5 times and still has a chance to maybe move up in weight and become a champion. But with Tyron Woodley, the reason, again, that this is so low is because Tyron Woodley goes on to lose the remainder 4 of his last fights of the UFC and then goes on to lose twice to Jake Paul in boxing. Like, come on. So, but still, you can never take that performance away from Kamaru Usman, and it lands him at number 9. Number 8, Rafael dos Anjos versus Anthony Pettis at UFC 185. All right, although this is one of the most lopsided victories of all time, and there's no secret at all that RDA is one of the most well-rounded fighters that we have ever seen, I will never forget this loss ever for Anthony Pettis because I was the biggest fan of him back in 2015, 2013, 2011, doesn't matter what year. After that Showtime kick that man had against Benson Henderson in the WEC, if you were a striker, a knockout artist, whatever it would be, you absolutely loved Anthony Pettis. And once the UFC signed WEC, it was off to the races. Although he had to come over a little loss against Clay Guida, he went on to beat Jeremy Stevens, knocked out Joe Lozon, knocked out Donald Cerrone with one of the most vicious body kicks you'll ever see, submits Benson Henderson for the belt, and then even defends it against Gilbert Melendez with a nasty submission. And at this time, man, Anthony Pettis was on his way to superstardom. Like, the UFC was pushing him. The man was on the Wheaties box. Like I said, had the Showtime kick, had an MTV show. They were setting him up for everything. And once RDA beats Nate Diaz, we all were like, oh, man, that was a fight we wanted to see. But from the beginning of the fight to the very end, this man absolutely one-way traffic, dominating Anthony Pettis, putting on one of the most masterful performances you've ever seen. He has 9 out of 10 takedowns, 14 minutes and 42 seconds of control time, and lands 144 strikes compared to Anthony Pettis' 96. And I don't even think he landed 96 strikes. I'll be honest with you. I think I only saw maybe 2 or 3 really nice punches, and I think he landed 1 nice body shot in the 4th round. And outside of 1 little takedown that actually ended up getting reversed, it was one of the most dominant performances of all time. And I know in 2024 it's not that shocking, but back in 2015 when Anthony Pettis was on top of the world and ready to go, oh my goodness, this was such a dominant performance. And although RDA and Anthony Pettis are on number 8 on this list, it's not even the most dominant performance from that night. Number 7, Joanna Jedrzejczyk versus Carla Esparza at UFC 185. And on this one, I got to be honest, I felt terrible throwing this one on there because it really feels like a grown-ass woman beating the absolute shit out of a little baby. Like, Joanna Jedrzejczyk put on one of the greatest performances of all time. And another reason it made the list is because Carla Esparza goes on to do some incredible things in her career, goes on to become champion again and beats the one that beats Joanna. So as impressive as this fight was, man, one-way traffic, so dominant. It's tough to watch if we're being honest. The amount of blood that comes out of Carla Esparza's face, it's one of the first beatdowns you see of a woman that's like, holy shit, this girl can strike. Like, oh my gosh. So not only does she outstrike her by nearly 50 strikes in a round and a half, but she also stuffs 16 of the 17 takedowns that Carla Esparza throws. And it's still to this day one of the most dominant performances and maybe one of the most brutal performances you'll ever see. Number 6, TJ Dillashaw versus Renan Barão at UFC 173. You know, in 2024 right now, this fight probably doesn't age the best because of the PED situation with TJ Dillashaw. And then, of course, Renan Barão doesn't even fight anymore. So I'm sure a lot of people that weren't watching back then are probably sitting here like, who the hell's Renan Barão? But if you guys go back and watch this, man, this dude was on a 32-fight win streak in MMA, in professional MMA. He was knocking out everybody in the UFC, submitting him. It didn't matter. He was the most well-rounded fighter you could possibly have. And quite literally, if you guys go back and watch this one and listen to the broadcast, Joe Rogan compares this man to prime Mike Tyson probably 5 or 6 times in this fight. In less than 40 days before this, Renan Barão had just knocked out Uriah Faber, who was the Team Alpha Male leader, who's the captain, and that's exactly where TJ Dillashaw was at the time. But what makes this fight so much fun, and not even the fight, I guess, but this is the beginning of the end of Team Alpha Male. This is when TJ Dillashaw and Dwayne Ludwig, you know, finally get together, and they're creating this monster striker. And you can see it in this fight. This is the beginning of it all. This is the reason Team Alpha Male breaks up here. And so it's really cool to go back and look at the support that Uriah Faber is giving to TJ Dillashaw. And it's just amazing. But from the very beginning of the fight all the way till the end, TJ Dillashaw's striking was on another level. And this is what Renan Barão, at the time, Renan Barão was the best striker. He had the most power at 135 that we had ever seen. So for young TJ Dillashaw to get this title, he was the replacement for this fight. And for him to just jump in there and to go out and dominate him the way he did, you know, phenomenal. He almost had him out of there I don't know how many times in the first round, second round, third round. But the most impressive part about this entire fight is, unlike some of the fights that we watched before where they definitely have a clean decision happening and they're not going to try to, you know, ruin it or anything or chance it, TJ Dillashaw in the 5th round unleashes on Renan Barão and gets him out of there and finishes him with a knockout in the 5th round. It's one of the craziest fights you'll ever watch. The pace from TJ Dillashaw, you know, if he was on PEDs back then, it makes sense because that man was just pushing the pace the entire night. Oh my gosh, the combos, man. If you guys are into Muay Thai and into the combos, you guys go back and watch this fight. And TJ Dillashaw is just, oh my god, you guys will learn a thing or two. So, but this for sure is supposed to be up there. They go on to rematch a couple times, and it's just as dominant as it was the first time. So shouts out to TJ Dillashaw. And despite what you guys may feel about him, this performance definitely deserves to be up here. Number 5, Holm versus Ronda Rousey at UFC 193. You know, not only does Holm put on one of the greatest performances of all time, and I know right now in 2024, it's easy to look back and just say, oh, Ronda Rousey's striking wasn't as great as everybody hyped it up to be. But when we go back and really understand why this was so shocking, is, man, I truly think if it wasn't for Ronda Rousey, I don't know when the UFC would have ever had women come over. Because in 2011, just 12 years ago, and this was already during the superstardom of Ronda Rousey, Dana White was asked if he would ever have women's MMA ever in the UFC, and he said,
yes. When are we going to see women in the UFC, man?
Never.
Anytime soon? Never? Ever?
I would like to bring the champ out here. Ronda! UFC Women's Champion, Ronda Rousey.
Down the road, 30 years from now, 40 years from now, 60 years from now, Ronda Rousey's name is going to stay there forever. She's going to be the reason that women were in the UFC. She's an icon. And at the time, people were hyping her up to say that she could have beat most of the men. They were wondering if she was the greatest fighter of all time. They were asking if she was as dominant as Mike Tyson. This is how impressive this woman was. Her her last 4 fights leading into the Holm fight were a combined of 2 minutes and 10 seconds because she was just dominating ladies. But of course, she falls in love with her striking, and this is why we're talking about this video now, because Holm goes out there and gives her one of the biggest ass whoopings that we have ever seen. And what truly makes us so impressive on Holm's part is she absolutely shut down Ronda Rousey for the rest of her career. Took her career from her. And although she'll never reach that success in her career again, she will forever be known as the Ronda Rousey killer. Number 4, Sean Strickland versus Israel Adesanya at UFC 293. I know this one's just a couple months old, and I know a lot of Israel Adesanya fans are going to be sitting there and saying, oh, off night and whatnot, but rewatching this one really solidifies why it should be on this list. And I know I did this for Sean Strickland because he's fighting this weekend, but still, this is one of the greatest displays of defense I've ever watched ever in MMA, especially when we're talking about one of the greatest strikers that we've ever seen in the UFC when we're talking about Israel Adesanya. We've watched what this guy has done to some of the greatest strikers, some of the greatest athletes we've ever watched in the sport. And for Sean Strickland to come in there and to do what he did to Israel Adesanya, oh my goodness. Everybody was writing him off. Nobody believed in him. It was supposed to be Dricus Du Plessis fighting that night, and Israel Adesanya says, "Oh, you want to play games? Well, I'm just gonna gift this title shot to Sean Strickland." And look what happened. It came back and bit him right in the ass. Easily one of the biggest upsets of all time. But like I said, what makes this fight so impressive, it's not that knockdown in the first round. I promise it's not. Even though it's what we're going to see forever, it's how he shut down every little thing that Israel Adesanya threw. Leg kicks, good luck. Wasn't getting them. I was blocking everything. The Philly shell, oh my gosh. He couldn't land a punch. There wasn't a single thing that Israel Adesanya could do. And by the end of the fight, Sean Strickland is literally screaming in his face with his hands down. And we're sitting here wondering what the hell we just watched. So clearly this one deserves to be up there. But truly at the end of the day, this one's going to go down years and years from now as one of the greatest upsets of all time and one of the greatest performances by a challenger we've ever seen in title fight history. And I know it's easy to make this list now when it's 4 months, 5 months old. But I promise you guys 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 years from now, it's going to stand the test of time. So this is well-deserved at number 4. Number 3. Cody Garbrandt versus Dominic Cruz at UFC 207. And when we talk about perfect performances, I think Cody Garbrandt at UFC 207 has got to be on a short list, if not a top 3 performance of all time when it comes to one fight. And when we look at the opponent, it's what makes it even more impressive. Dominic Cruz was the king of 135. He was the king of 125 there for a little bit. This man had beat everybody, hasn't lost in 9 years going into this fight. The only loss that he had was to Uriah Faber, and he already right that wrong twice. And the dude was 22-1 going into this fight, and it could have been even scarier of a career if he didn't get hurt as much as he did. But to take out these guys that he took out, the man took out Mighty Mouse, took out Ian McCall, took out Joey Benavidez twice, took out TJ Dillashaw, took out Uriah Faber. I mean, the man was known as the team alpha male killer. So for Cody Garbrandt to come into UFC 207 and Dominic Cruz, it makes it one of the greatest performances of all time. And one of the weird things about rewatching this fight, though, I didn't realize that the fight was that close. I think it was like 49-46, 49-46, and 48-47 across the board, which is way closer than you would expect after watching that fight since it was so dominant. But rightfully so at number 3. Number 2, Jon Jones versus Shogun Rua at UFC 128. Now, when we talk about the most dominant and new performances of all time, Jon Jones versus Shogun Rua at UFC 128 really might take the cake. Not only does Jon Jones become the youngest UFC champion of all time at 23 years old, but he takes out an absolute legend who has not only a Hall of Fame career in Pride, but also has a Hall of Fame career in the UFC. But if we really look at Shogun Rua, that man took out Rampage Jackson, Alistair Overeem twice, Chuck Liddell, the Nogueira brothers, Lyoto Machida. The man did everything. Forrest Griffin, whoever you want to name, Shogun Rua beat him. But in February 2011, when Rashad Evans was forced out of his fight with Shogun Rua, all eyes were on the fight of Jon Jones and Ryan Bader. Because at the time, both were undefeated prospects who everybody was hyping up to become the next champion. And when Jon Jones destroyed Ryan Bader with a nasty submission, one of the greatest post-fight interviews of all time took place. And on just a month's notice, Jon Jones, a young 23-year-old, steps into the octagon against one of the biggest legends of the sport, Shogun Rua, and the rest is history when Jon Jones puts on one of the greatest performances we had ever seen. And one of my favorite things about going back to watch was easily by far watching how versatile Jon Jones was. I mean, for heaven's sakes, he opens the fight with a flying knee, and then from there on out, just absolutely dissects Shogun Rua with nasty oblique kicks, side kicks, front kicks, teep kicks, and then don't even get me going with the spinning elbows, the knees. Everything that this man was doing was just breaking Shogun down. And going back and watching this, you kind of forget how brutal of an ass whooping this was. I mean, easily Jon Jones breaks Shogun Rua's cheek in this fight. And to make this thing the most impressive is the man lands 102 of his 142 strikes. And it says Shogun Rua lands 11 of 42. I promise you guys, this man might land one right hand in the entire fight. He gets absolutely shut down. And for you guys out there that don't know why Jon Jones is so hyped, please go back and watch this fight. And also, this man might have the greatest ground and pound that we had ever seen. This dude made Shogun Rua tap to strikes. It was one of the most phenomenal performances ever, one of the cleanest performances of all time, and by far up there with one of the greatest and most dominant and new moments of all time. Number 1, Conor McGregor versus Eddie Alvarez at UFC 205. I mean, come on now. Like, it's the double champ. It's the champ. Like, Conor McGregor that night, if you like him or not, you cannot deny that that man Whoever they put in front of him that night, he was going to knock them out. It did not matter who it was. Eddie Alvarez, RDA, Nate Diaz. Habib. It didn't matter that night. Conor McGregor, this is why he gets the love that he gets. This is why he's as big as he is. Like, that performance in the biggest time, the biggest place, Madison Square Garden, one of the biggest cards we had ever seen. I mean, my goodness, one of the greatest performances. This is easily the most accurate performance you'll ever see. This man didn't miss a single shot. The way he was just in rhythm, in space, oh my God. The way that he was just controlling distance, easily the best performance that you could ever see when it comes to the challenger beating a champ. And I know he's technically 145 champ in this one, but he was fighting for the 155 belts. But it's definitely well-deserved of being on a top 5 list on any list when it comes to dominant performances by champions. So I appreciate you guys watching, and hopefully you guys enjoyed this, and please keep on the lookout. I got plenty more videos coming.